Thank you, Jesse. Yes, so as last time I planned in like 20 minutes for question round, and there were so many questions I could have done it for 40 minutes. I decided that this time I will make a short roundup about who I am, what I do as a hobby, and what it has to do with video and computer games. And then I will talk a bit about my experience in the recent year since the last conference, so people get an understanding of what happened since then and how it felt for me being kind of a hobbyist and not a journalist that is paid for what he does. Okay, so I'm Joerg Droege, and I'm a retro fan, and actually I started out in the retro community with a Commodore 64 that I got from my grandfather in 1990, and then I discovered the demo scene in 98 and actually joined it. So, and then when I joined the demo scene, I figured out that there is this problem with the old machines, that some machines run on NTSC 60 Hz and some run on 50 Hz, and the scenes, the user groups are largely divided by PAL and NTSC by 50 and 60 Hz because the programs are sometimes not really very compatible. So we decided we make a disc magazine that runs on a 5.25 inch disc that is running on a C64, having kind of a plug and play and detecting whether it's running on an American or a European machine. Well, so we did this disc mag for a while, and then we had a short break, and actually then we continued. So what started out as a disc magazine actually evolved in 2010 to become a lot more. For example, in 2012, I actually discovered that some people are asked to write articles for us, like industry pioneers in the computer business or video game business, or ask them to interview. They said, I don't want to answer emails, questions and answer. How about recording it on Skype? It's easier for me to sit with you for an hour and talk than typing it, attacking it into a keyboard. So that is how it started out in 2012, that next to the disc magazine, we started out making a YouTube interview videos. First with John Draper, Captain Crunch, who invented the blue box and did phone phreaking in the 70s. So, and then we started out with Michael Tomczak, who was marketing manager at Commodore back in the day. And this way we actually evolved it into a lot more like having live Twitch shows where we actually try to make crazy things. For example, we used an alpha version of the C64 Vice emulator, the alpha feature of using it multiplayer online. And since that function is so old and so unreliable, we actually had to make a VPN to my router to actually make it possible. And then it was crashing all the time, and we anyway go and went online doing a live show on Twitch, and people were actually really crazy about it. The interesting thing is that it turned out, for some reason, we have a lot more influence after a while, because we had a guest, and this guest was pretty much known in the retro scene, and we did Wheel of Fortune as one of the last games, and we figured out a few weeks after that like 30-40 channels on Twitch involved into retro gaming actually played Wheel of Fortune on the Commodore 64, probably because we started it, and was like, wow, my god, that's really interesting. So, and you probably heard this retro hype that's really getting crazy and going out recently. What started like even involving bigger last year with the NES Classic Mini. So one thing that happened last year is actually that national television in Germany actually came with a camera team and got me an NES Classic Mini from Nintendo Germany and said, okay, we want you on our news, so let's play Super Mario Bros. And talk a bit about the retro hobby. So it's interesting that this, what started as a hobby, as a disc magazine for the Commodore 64, actually involves in a lot more. And the more years we are doing this, the more crazier, or how to say, more entertaining it gets, looking at statistics of podcast visitors, listeners, videos, and so on, and receiving email from YouTube like, you've reached another 1,000 subscribers, congratulations. so I'm really thankful for the video game industry to give us this opportunity. Also, we are on Gamescom and having a booth in the retro area where we present the magazine and talk to people actually, and running around the business area doing interviews with designers and coders and marketing managers and PR from companies like Konami, EA, and other publishers. So that's really something that's really wonderful. And so I hope my perspective as being a hobbyist, but still trying to fill in a gap and getting all sides of a story is something interesting for you. Because, for example, in our podcast, we decided to actually interview EA about FIFA Soccer, Konami about Pro Evolution Soccer, and then finally we had Sean Hare, who did Sensible Soccer and Micropro Soccer, and is actually just released Sociable Soccer in an early alpha with 3D, which is something that neither EA nor Konami actually considered doing in a football game. So it's really interesting. For example, right now the big craze is also about the Z64 Mini, and it's interesting because most people in the retro scene that I see on Facebook and other places where I'm connected with the retro scene, they are like, bragging like it's another emulator. But in fact, it's not an emulator, it's an FPGA, and it's not a software emulation. And actually, we did this interview with the guy who leads the project like a year ago, but it seems that largely people are ignoring the facts because they are disappointed by what happened in the past. So we actually try to make things a bit different here at Scene World, and it's fun to see that more and more people like it. One thing about video game publishing, about publishers, that I would like to mention, for example, is this year before Gamescom, we make appointments and so on, and actually interesting thing is that this year we got invitations for interview in the business area, and more publishers were promoting their games to us, like, come and talk to us, and they are calling it a role-playing game because it has a story mode in it. Well, that's something that I figured that was kind of a trend in 2017. More and more game publishers taking their beat-em-up game, racing game, or whatever game, calling it a role-playing game, and adding another name in front of it. For example, action role-playing game or racing role-playing game. or super adventurous role-playing game. But actually, I'm coming from the 80s and 90s, and as a gamer from that time, I never actually thought that you should do that, you know. So I actually wrote back to one publisher and asked, like, why is this a role-playing game? It looks to me like a beat 'em up. Yeah. All right. So that's actually what we are doing. Another thing that we actually focus on, apart from video game interviews and reviews and so on, always, of course, from the retro perspective, is also making video interviews on YouTube, recorded via Skype most of the time, with tech pioneers. For example, probably you heard like earlier this year that the Finnish inventor of SMS died. And that was quite funny because it was all over the news, you know, CNN and all the other places, even if just on the web portal. And I was like, well, wait, the inventor of SMS didn't die. No, it was actually a German. And that was actually last year. And so I did an interview with the German inventor Friedhelm Hillebrand in Skype via video. And it's interesting because it was the first interview that was ever done in English with him. So it's kind of interesting that despite there are so many podcasts around, so many retro magazines and journalism projects, there are still some gaps to fill, and that is what actually we are trying to do with the Scene World. And right, so for example, this Sunday actually I will talk with Chris Hülsbeck, who is a famous computer video game composer, and we will have something called Coffee Clutch and actually interview him in a flipper and arcade museum in Seligenstadt by Frankfurt here in Germany. So it's quite interesting, you know. And I have to say this hobby actually involved into a lot more, and actually is also branching out into other areas. For example, 4 weeks ago I actually was in Japan, Tokyo, and I was hanging around with Yesh Tarakura, the former lead engineer of Commodore Japan. So, and actually I also met his friend, also from Japan, who invented S-Video. That's really exciting for me, because when we started all this 17 years ago, actually in November the 1st, we formed our staff. We didn't think that we would be invited by Gamescom to have a booth or actually talk to really big guys in the video game industry, you know. So I'm really thankful for that. And so I hope that we are able to fill the gap in a way here. For example, recently we did an interview with Tectoy, who is actually, probably you heard it, the license taker of Sega for, well, Mega Drives and Master Systems, and still doing it. And sometimes it's amazing because people don't realize how hard it is to get people to talk to you. For in the example of Tectoy, either people are not responsible or they don't feel confident enough to talk in English on a podcast, you know. So this took like 5 years until I actually got somebody to talk to me. So a lot of time that we invest at Scene World is actually doing research, doing calls, writing to people, going to events, and it's really for me an interesting experience, because actually other people are doing it for a living, like most of you, I guess, that listen to me right now, and I'm doing it as a hobbyist next to my normal job, which I like very much, by the way, but still it's like an add-on, and it's a fun one, and right, so that is actually how things are right now, and I hope we actually can next year going out to other platforms. For example, we on Gamescom we actually had an alpha version of SteamWorld magazine on Amiga, running on an Amiga, and that is also something special for us, because the disc magazine scene on the Amiga is dead. There's no disc magazine anymore. And that's also something that you realize when you go to Gamescom, that a lot of things actually die out. And if you go, for example, to certain areas and talk to certain young people, you also understand that knowledge is dying out. A prominent example from the indie developer side, a lot of games actually have retro graphic, and this is very pluggy. And the thing is, it wasn't so pluggy back in the 80s when I was a kid and I played NES or whatever, or C64, because we had CRTs, cathode ray tube TVs, and that was blurry, so we wouldn't see it like bloggy. And especially in the indie game development things, I discovered that a lot of developers actually concentrate on blocky graphics because it's hip again. But on the other side, I was always a fan of the SID music, or by the C64, or the music by the Game Boy NES. But on the other hand, when it comes to the music, most game developers say, actually, no, that is causing ear cancer, or my ears to bleed. I actually want to have modern music, So I think maybe this is something where you guys should or could improve from my perspective. I would like to have a mode from games where you actually can choose between classic music and modern music, like retro gaming music. I figured that a lot of remastered games like Monkey Island or whatever actually offer you a retro graphic mode and a modern graphic mode, but it has nothing about the music. So maybe that is something I should throw in as a suggestion to game developer, because from my perspective as a retro gaming fan, I like, if I play a game that is supposed to be like a retro game, I want to have it retro like all the way down, not only the graphic but also the music. And that is something where most developers say no. Exception is if the game actually was an arcade game. I figured, for example, when Outrun Coast to Coast was released in 2006, so there was actually an option to actually play the arcade music, the original one, in the game. I found that quite interesting, but it's unfortunately an exception, not the rule. So And when it comes to blocky graphic, I would like to have, like a raster option, that you have the raster bars, at least. Sorry, I meant scan lines, yeah. So at least you have the scan lines, so at least it feels a bit like it. For example, what the NES Classic Mini and the SNES Classic Mini is doing. Not perfectly, but it's quite okay. Yeah, so that is my perspective. Another thing that I've noted this year is actually that a lot of game developers at Gamescom, a lot of publishers, said they wouldn't focus on releasing their games on the Switch because of saying that the possibilities of the console is not very good. And that's quite funny because, for example, when it comes to retro games that are supposed to be blocky and so on, I would think they are perfectly a candidate to release them on the Switch. But a lot of developers actually fearing that it wouldn't have high enough frame rate and so on. And that's something that a lot of you younger developers actually don't remember or don't know because they weren't born yet. But for example, there were 3D games like Thriller, and they had like 1 frame per every 10 seconds. And we would call that awesome because it was polygons with texture on it, even if it was just one colored texture, cubicles. But anyway, we thought it was pretty rad, was pretty cool. Of course, I understand that nowadays everybody wants to have the highest frame rate possible, but I think it would be interesting to make a slow-paced game and see how things would work out. Maybe a totally different concept, because most games actually they are like go as fast as possible from one point to another. Maybe do something the other way around. Yeah. So that is all in all my experience that I had this year. And also one thing that I've noticed is that despite a lot of publishers are actually going, especially in the indie area, and say we make a boxed version, I think that unfortunately some of those don't understand what it means to have a boxed versioned game. For example, if you make a boxed versioned game, I would expect a CD or DVD or Blu-ray in it, and a printed manual. Okay, the printer's manual you usually don't have. Probably it's like self-explaining, or it's a PDF. But what also happens is sometimes you get an empty box and a poster and and an inlay notice paper with it saying download it from Steam. I was like, okay, that's not what I expect from a boxed version. I don't want just a piece of paper, especially because there are still people living on the countryside or countries where stable, fast internet is not available, and some of them actually buy those boxed games because of that. And so then they are disappointed. Yeah. One famous example, I think, was some years ago, Batman Arkham. I think Arkham Knight was it called? Yes. And you had to download like 60 gigabytes to get it run. Right. So that is generally my perspective and what happened to us this year. And since last year my 20 minutes questions and answering round were too short, I would say make it 30 minutes this year, and let's see how many questions we get in. So I'm actually following you on the main stage and the text area. So keep the questions coming and I will answer them as I read them, because I'm really interested to hear what you guys think about what I just said. So type some questions in. If there are no questions, then I will just continue talking. Let's see. All right. Oh yes, Indie Box did that very well. Right, yeah. Yeah, well, many box version actually rely on this Steam installer. I think that's quite neat, actually. It's a good solution. You can actually install it offline, but you still have it in Steam. I'm actually a good fan of Steam. But of course it worries me if a game is getting very old and is kind of getting removed, or if Steam someday decides to not work anymore, is going out of business. What is happening then? Well, USB drives instead of disks, is that good enough? Good statement. Yes, well, that's also something that's happening nowadays. USB drives, for example, in the shape of an SNES cartridge or so. Is that something I like? I don't know. I'm a disk guy. I understand that a lot of computers don't have a drive anymore, but at least they have a USB port and you could plug in an external drive there. Yeah, that's a good point. Disks are also cheaper to mass produce. Yeah. Yep, that's just what I said. Yeah, for example, 3 Realms actually is offering now to generate boxes for indie developers. So, right. Yes, you're right. Like I said, physical releases are coming up, but as I made my point, sometimes the physical releases are incomplete, I would say. And it doesn't really feel like back in the old days. Let me give you a positive example. For example, Thimbleweed Park, actually, the box version even had sprites on a 3.5 inch disc, and I'm one of the few people that actually has still a 3.5 inch disk drive USB in my computer, internally built in. And what some people don't know, even Windows 10 still has a 3.5 inch floppy disk driver. So hey, it still works. Especially good for old DOS games that only were released on discs. And you could actually use, DOSBox or ScumVM or whatever game engine you need, or operating or system emulator or so on, and then you can actually play the games from a disk. Ooh. Well, that's interesting comment. Couldn't Windows drop floppy support because A and B disks are still reserved? That's not entirely true. Actually, nowadays, since Windows Vista, you are able to use drive A and drive B for hard disk drives. But yes, automatically it's leaving out and starting at C. But actually, I tried it myself. I made an old disk drive, hard disk drive, 60 gigabytes, and said make it drive B. It works. Well, don't expect to play DVDs or run floppy disks. Well, I have to say, I have no problem with running floppy disks, and I have Windows 10, so I don't know where that problem is coming from. And for DVDs, I'm using VLC player, and there are plenty of other options. Yes, maybe it is because I actually use a USB disk floppy drive and not one that is actually depending on a parallel floppy port. Maybe that is not supported anymore. Like I said, yeah, that was just my comment. USB floppy disk drive still work. That is what I actually figured out. What do you think of preserving efforts like long plays or similar regarding preserving old games in video form? It's very good. Actually, I like watching long plays because sometimes, I figure out, okay, I never saw this part of a game, like an adventure, or never finished that game. Actually, I did an interview with Stuart Chaffee from Computer Chronicles, and most people didn't know before that interview I did with him. He actually kind of invented YouTube, and when he actually did the Computer Chronicles archives with the Wayback Machine, archive.org, YouTube was actually across the street, kind of, and they kind of stole the idea. So if you're interested in that, you should search on YouTube for Stuart Chaffee's Scene World interview, or go to youtube.sceneworld.org. There you can see our YouTube channel, or sceneworld.org. So yes, I think there should be more people efforting in preserving old stuff. Knowledge is very important, preserving knowledge, so that the kids of the kids nowadays still can experience what a floppy disk drive is. Because people with knowledge like us will die out sooner or later. Because we are all turning into dinosaurs in a few centuries. So I wish there were more projects preserving. I think that there are still many areas where preserving is lacking. So I think it's very important. I would say more power to them. Yeah, well, that's a good comment. Classifying games as art and actually setting up proper analog and criteria collection, but for games. That actually happened in Germany in 2015. I was part of the Film and Games Museum exhibition in the Frankfurt Film Museum in Germany. I was making Wednesday evening Twitch live shows with pioneers and VIPs from the video game and tech industry. For example, also with 3D Realms, Scott Miller talking about shareware and how he invented it, and also the Tron guy, one of the first known cosplayers, Jay Maynard, and actually there was also the European Union involved and actually talking about preserving video games just is as important as preserving movies. And the person responsible for the section movies and video games said they don't want to actually make the same mistake they did with silent movies, because some silent movies are lost forever because they started too late preserving them. And as you know, old arcade games actually had suicide batteries and some arcade games are actually dead and unpreservable, unfortunately, because the chips with the data on it actually is no more there. So it happened, fortunately, only in rare cases, but unfortunately it happens. So here in Germany and in Europe in general, by the way, video games are classified as history and as art and as preservable. So the European Union is actually putting a lot of money and effort into that. I know it firsthand because I was involved in one of those projects. And that was a pretty good experience. Made me feel proud because when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, video gaming was something like nerd, unsocial, go out and play instead. That was before internet. It even saw if you played at your birthday party with friends, people wouldn't see that on the outside. Fortunately, things are a lot more open nowadays. Yes, well, there are constantly announcements regarding big collections, largest video game museum, and so on. So actually, we're involved in making an English campaign for the Bolo Museum in the French part of Switzerland, which is like one of the largest museum, and they actually had the problem that their contract for rent ended, and they needed a new home for the big collection, and so we actually spoke to Yves Bologna, and we spoke about the history of Logitech and creating computer mice. So that was quite interesting. Right. Well, that's also a good point. Is cracking actually supporting preservation, like Razer? Well, I think preserving especially should be in a way how it was in the market back in the day. For example, if you would never preserve, never scan manuals, never take photos of packages, in some years you wouldn't know what the game actually looked like, And as you probably know, some physical games, some originals are pretty pricey nowadays. There are versions of games and releases that are valued a couple of $100 or even thousands of dollars, And as I'm also a collector, I'm really paying attention to that, and I'm always happy if I can find a rare physical retro game from back in the day at a good price. Well, pragmatic vision. Game is what matters. It's all digital. Yeah, is it? Yeah, good question. Well, my opinion is I like the experience of unwrapping a game, like a physical box. Am I getting the same feeling when I download a game image, a game data from Steam? Not really. So, I'm sorry, I'm not really a big fan of all digital. I really prefer physical. Well, that's at least my point of view here. But let's see, as somebody pointed out earlier, some publishers are actually going the other way around and going more physical again. So it probably depends on what side of the fence you are sitting, if you are for one or for another. well, anyway, I think it's a lot more fun to have a real NES or an NES Classic Mini than having an emulator, and it's the same with games, you know. And imagine if you meet a famous game developer, you can give him a pen and he could sign it and make the game a lot more value. You can't do that if the game is all digital. How would you generate value? In most cases, you even can't resell digital games, and that's another thing. You know, of course, there are services that sell Steam accounts with games on it, but the question is that something worthy? Yeah, it's a good idea. Go to the local bookshop and print out a game poster. Yeah, but anyway, it's a little different here. All right. I don't know. You know, when I am at Gamescom and when I meet old game developers and I give them a game box from 30 years ago, you know, I said I found it. Like, how did you get it? eBay. How much did you pay? 70 euros. Wow, why? Because I knew you would be at Gamescom and I want you to sign it. So I spent 70 euros just to have you sign it and say, yes, I got this game. That's to have those people and seeing the faces when they look at the game they worked on and published like 30 years ago, and suddenly they have to sign this exact game anymore. Again, it's priceless. It's actually priceless. So, for nothing in the world, I would do that with a poster. Yeah, online features being lost seems like a serious issue. That's also true. That's also something you didn't have in the day. There were other problems back in the day. For example, there was Summer Olympiad 88 by Tyrant Software, and actually they had a problem. They had that was Siri, sorry. And actually they had the problem that there was a bug in the multiplayer function. And as soon as you entered a second name and set it on start the game, it would reset the game and you would end up with the opening screen again. So sometimes, even if you didn't have online features, the multiplayer feature could still be broken and you couldn't apply a patch. To have a more recent example, there are also options where publishers went out and said, okay, we will redirect the IP and you can make your open source multiplayer function, and then we will support it with the games that we sold. So despite we switched off our multiplayer or feature servers, that would be, for example, EA with Command & Conquer. If you go in an old Command & Conquer game and click on multiplayer, you're actually redirected to the project that is making it possible to play the 20 years old games again multiplayer, or 10 years old, depending on which part of the Command & Conquer you're playing. Yes, so you see, there are solutions for all problems. The question is how much a publisher, a company, a coder wants to invest in that, you know. That's really depending on that. Well, for example, talking about arcade games, there is Dave Lowe, who actually did like most conversions of arcade games music-wise on the game consoles, home consoles, and computers back in the 80s and 90s. He did a lot. He did like the most, like Power Trip, like Street Fighter 2, you know. a lot of them. And so he actually released an orchestra CD last year with all his classical games music, and actually he went back to his old assembler code playing routines and relearned assembler kind of, and all the differences from the machines, and took the original machines and said, okay, I want to make this work, and I want to have this orchestra play my game music in the way I would like. I would love them to listen like, to sound like. All right, now that's a long way from the multiplayer or loot box question, but this is how things turned out. Yeah. Can I link the CD? Yes, sure. If you go to our Scene World homepage and you go to the podcast and section, sceneworld.org, and there is that podcast interview with Dave Lowe and his daughter. And there's more info in the podcast description where you can find all the other stuff. Yeah, right. You're welcome. So that's one of the good things. We always keep the links in our podcast description and in YouTube in the video descriptions. So if somebody wants to know more about the person we are talking to, or we talk to, people can actually check out their stuff. All right. Yeah, about EA, I don't know actually how this all happened to be that that Command & Conquer could still be played multiplayer. I don't know the details about that. It's just something that I was playing one of the games years later, and I clicked on it and I got redirected to the project that's actually hosting a server now. And I think I tried it like 3 years ago or 2 years ago last time, and the project was still alive. There was another multiplayer network that had the same faith. Was GameSpy. There's also an open GameSpy project ever since GameSpy closed. Which is kind of sad that it closed, because me and my friends, we would actually sit down together once every week, and we would play PlayStation 2 games over the internet while we all sit, each of us separately at home, because the GameSpy was still working, so we could play like 8 years old PlayStation 2 games. That was pretty fun. Right. So, 10 minutes to go. Do we have more questions actually? Or did I answer everything and there's no questions to be asked? Well, maybe I should mention is there are some people I would really love to interview and I didn't get a hold of. So I'm shouting this out. Maybe somebody can help me. And there are basically 3 names. That would be Bruce Artwick, who invented home computer flight simulation. He's having his own company, Sublogic, and then it was taken over by Microsoft, and he did the flight simulator for Microsoft. And I know he generally says he doesn't do interviews, but there is an interview on YouTube, and it's really, really bad. 10 minutes, and it's done by a person who has no actually idea who he is talking to, and what he actually really did. And another person would be Steve Wozniak. Every time we try the PR agent says try again next year, he's too busy. And that's actually happening since the last 7 years. So maybe somebody knows somebody. And another person would be Chris Roberts, that we also tried to get for an interview since a long time. So that would be my 3 pioneers on the wish list. So maybe somebody knows somebody. If so, this person can contact me over the sceneworld.org homepage, and there is actually a contact form, and if you send an email there, this email goes exclusively to me. Yeah, right. I could give Steve Wozniak a NixiTube watch. Yeah, right. Yeah, give some gifts, give some presents. Maybe that would convince people. That's a good idea. Yeah. But what is if you send them a parcel and they still say no? Then you spend all the money and all the investment in vain. Good idea. Maybe if there's something else. Right. So, anything else in the pipeline? Not really right now. Okay. So, while I'm waiting for other questions to come up, let's talk a bit about future plans. So, what are we planning to do from now till the next conference? If I'm invited next year again for the conference. So, what we want to reach? What are our goals? Well, the good thing is we got a new webmaster, though the homepage is no longer a problem. And of course we want to grow, and we are going to actually spend a bit more on promotion. Of course we want to be at Gamescom next year again, maybe doing something special retro wise. We don't know yet, but there are some ideas. And right, hopefully getting even more subscribers on YouTube and more awesome guests on our podcast. So a lot of people ask me from the video game industry, why don't you do this for a living? Well, the thing is, if I do this for a living, it's not really maybe as fun anymore, because suddenly you have the pressure, you have to have a certain release out at a certain time, or you have to have a certain amount of people listening to what you do or to YouTube. And then sometimes there are rivals in the video game industry. Last year when I spoke here, there were like 2 groups. One said EA is bad, the other group said Konami is bad, so, and I don't know, I really would like to stay neutral. And the question is also that I'm asked a lot, why don't you turn your hobby into a job? That's the other thing is, well, how long does the retro hype keep on? Will it die out in 5 years, or will it go on forever? I'm not so sure. I don't know if I want to base my life on a gamble, how long a certain trend is going on. The retro trend actually, for me personally, started in 2010, and with a few signs before that, like in 2004, the DTV, and then Speedlink reproducing C64 competition pro joysticks. Not really good quality, but at least they did. Right. So, good point. Retro hype never dies. just pick up new old topics. 5 years ago, there was no PS1. Well, don't know. I would challenge that. I'm not sure. You know, if you slaughter one thing till death and you do it again, it could happen that the generation after or the generation now says, okay, we are good with pixelated graphics. We don't want that anymore. Go somewhere else. So, and then the retro hype is no more. You never know, you know. It's like people thought physical media would never die, and now, as somebody pointed out, companies are moving to USB sticks. Right. Alrighty. So, 2 minutes left, I see on my clock, and I probably will get a reminder soon. So let's. Yeah, my third time. So yeah. Next. Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. Thank you. Yeah, so anyway, sceneworld.org is our homepage. YouTube.sceneworld.org is our YouTube channel. And you can actually Google for Scene World. If you want to know all about the history, more than I could cover in 1 hour, go to the English Wikipedia and enter in Scene World magazine. There is a whole article about Scene World, how it started, who we interviewed, who interviewed me, who we worked with, why, what we did, when, and so on. It's all covered with references and so on, as typical Wikipedia entry. So I hope you like it. If you have any questions to me, you can go, as I said, to the contact page of sceneworld.org or hit me on other channels, you know. My name, Joerg Droege, is pretty easy to find. My nickname is Nafcom, Nafcom, and that is also my username on Skype, Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. And Scene World is also on our name on all those channels, except Twitter, we're scene_world, because Scene World was already taken by somebody else. And Instagram is sceneworld64, because of the same reason. Okay, that's it. My time is up. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for sitting through this with me. And thanks for inviting me, Jesse. It was a pleasure.